The restaurant floated among the clouds, a sterile sanctuary of glass and steel perched atop a New York City skyscraper. Below, the city sprawled out like a galaxy of muted lights, a spectacle so grand it felt impersonal, a world away from the hushed conversations happening within. Each table was an island of calculated elegance, occupied by men and women who wore their wealth like armor. The air was thin with the scent of expensive perfume and gourmet food. But it was a cold, empty opulence. Laughter didn't echo here. It was absorbed by the plush carpets and the vast, indifferent view. It was a place built to showcase success, yet it felt like a monument to loneliness, where every smile was a negotiation and every word was weighed for its value. At a corner table, Julian Sterling sat as a king on a throne of his own making. At 35, he was the CEO of a tech empire, a billionaire whose name commanded respect in every boardroom. His suit was a masterpiece of tailoring, his watch a quiet testament to his fortune. Yet, for all his external perfection, a profound weariness had settled deep within his features. His eyes, sharp and analytical, scanned the room, but saw nothing that held his interest. They were the eyes of a man who had conquered the world, but had lost the map to his own heart. He viewed the people around him not as souls, but as assets and liabilities, a sad consequence of a past betrayal that had taught him to equate affection with a price tag. Moving between the islands of wealth was Clara Ross, a waitress whose presence was a quiet rebellion against the room's sterile atmosphere. She was 23, and the fatigue of working 2 jobs to fund her architecture studies and care for her sick mother was etched faintly around her expressive brown eyes. Still, those eyes held a stubborn flicker of hope. Her uniform, though showing the subtle signs of wear, was immaculate. She performed her duties with a graceful efficiency, observing the patrons not with envy, but with a deep, empathetic curiosity. She saw past the designer clothes and perfect smiles, wondering about the real stories, the hidden heartaches, and the quiet dreams that lived behind their carefully constructed facades. The pressure from his partners had been mounting all evening. Julian needed a date for the upcoming gala, an accessory to complete the image of a man who had everything. His gaze fell upon Clara, and in that moment, she ceased to be a person. She became a solution, a simple, discreet transaction. He approached her as she cleared a nearby table, his manner as direct and devoid of warmth as a corporate directive. He offered her $25,000 to play the part of his girlfriend for one night. The words hung in the air, a brutal, humiliating proposition. For Clara, it was a collision of crushing need and wounded dignity. Tears welled in her eyes, but her voice was steady when she accepted. And for the first time in years, a business deal left Julian Sterling with the unfamiliar, unsettling sting of guilt. The drive to the exclusive dinner party was a study in silence, broken only by the hum of the luxury sedan gliding through the city's arteries. Julian handed Clara a small, embossed card with bullet points detailing her fabricated life. A degree in art history, a family in Connecticut, a shared passion for sailing. He explained it coolly, as if briefing a new hire on corporate policy. For him, this was risk management. But for Clara, clutching the card in her lap, each lie felt like a small tear in the fabric of her own identity. She watched the glittering skyline blur past the window, the immense buildings, a testament to a world she was only pretending to belong to, feeling the chasm between her reality and this charade widen with every block they traveled. Upon arrival, they were ushered into a penthouse apartment that felt more like a modern art gallery than a home. The air was thick with the scent of orchids and quiet ambition. Julian's friends, a circle of venture capitalists and society heirs, greeted them with smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. They appraised Clara with a polite but piercing curiosity, their questions about her background wrapped in a veneer of casual interest. Each inquiry felt like a test, a subtle challenge to the story Julian had paid for. Clara could feel their skepticism like a physical weight, the pressure to perform perfectly mounting with every passing second, knowing that a single misstep would unravel the entire illusion and expose her for what she was, an imposter in a borrowed dress. Yet, as the evening wore on, something shifted. When asked about her supposed art history background, Clara didn't recite the dry facts Julian had provided. Instead, she spoke of the way light fell across the buildings she saw from her bus window every morning, describing the city's architecture as a living sculpture. She talked about the resilience of structures designed to withstand storms, her words carrying an unintentional but palpable parallel to her own life. Julian watched, initially tense, then fascinated. She wasn't acting. She was translating her own truths into a language this audience could understand. Her authenticity was disarming, a quiet melody of sincerity in a room full of noise. And for the first time, Julian saw a flicker of the woman behind the role. The true turning point arrived with dessert. A cynical friend named Mark, who had been watching Clara with the predatory focus of a hawk, leaned forward and posed the question everyone was thinking. "So, Clara," he began, his voice laced with insinuation, "what does a woman with so much soul see in a hardened businessman like Julian?" A hush fell over the table. Clara didn't flinch. She looked directly at Julian and recalled a small moment she had witnessed at the restaurant weeks ago. An elderly couple, flustered over their bill, and Julian discreetly signaling to the manager to take care of it without a word. "I saw a man who builds empires," she said softly, "but who also understands the value of a quiet act of kindness." Julian felt the words land like a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. He had no memory of the event, a minor, almost unconscious gesture, yet she had seen it. She had noticed a flicker of the man he used to be, a person he thought had been buried long ago under layers of cynicism and ambition. His friends were silenced, their skepticism momentarily replaced by a grudging respect. But Julian was no longer aware of them. He was looking at Clara, truly seeing her, and the carefully constructed walls around his heart began to crack. The $25,000 felt like a pittance, an insult to the person sitting beside him, and a profound, unfamiliar shame washed over him. The ride home was enveloped in a new kind of silence, one that was no longer empty but filled with unspoken questions. The polished leather and quiet engine of the car seemed to create an intimate space, a bubble separate from the rest of the world. It was Julian who finally broke it, his voice softer than Clara had ever heard it. "Where did you learn to see people like that?" he asked, the question devoid of any businesslike tone. It was a genuine inquiry, a confession of his own blindness and a quiet plea to understand her perspective. He wasn't her employer anymore, and she wasn't his date for hire. In that moment, they were simply two people, stripped of their roles, beginning to navigate the uncharted territory of a real connection. Clara turned from the window, her gaze meeting his in the dim light of the car. She spoke of her mother, of the long, quiet hours spent in hospital waiting rooms, a place where fortunes and titles meant nothing. "There," she explained, "you learn to read the stories etched on people's faces, the fear, the hope, the quiet endurance." She described her mother's unwavering grace in the face of constant pain, a woman who taught her that dignity wasn't something you owned, but something you carried within you. Her story was not one of self-pity, but of profound strength, a glimpse into the world of sacrifice and love that had shaped her. It's stories like these, of quiet courage, that remind us of the strength of the human spirit. If you feel the same way, please consider subscribing to our channel, as your support helps us continue to share these powerful accounts. Julian was captivated, but as his admiration grew, so did his fear. The ghost of his past betrayal loomed large in his mind. His former fiancée, a woman who had spoken of love with the same sincerity, only to vanish after liquidating a joint account he had set up for their future. The memory was a cold hand on his shoulder, whispering that vulnerability was a trap. He felt an instinctual urge to pull back, to retreat to the safety of transactional relationships where the terms were clear and the risks were calculated. This burgeoning feeling for Clara felt dangerous, an unknown variable in the carefully controlled equation of his life. His internal conflict was a silent, raging storm behind his calm exterior. His friend Mark, however, had no such internal battle. Fueled by suspicion and a touch of jealousy, he hired a private investigator to dig into Clara's life. The report that landed on his desk was concise and damning. It detailed her worn-out apartment building in a working-class neighborhood, her 2 waiting jobs, and the crushing weight of her mother's medical debts. There were no art degrees, no family estates in Connecticut. There was only a young woman struggling to survive. Mark looked at the file, not with empathy, but with a sense of vindication. He now held the truth in his hands, a weapon he intended to use to expose Julian's perceived weakness and put this waitress firmly back in her place. The stage for this public execution was a lavish charity gala a week later. Julian, having decided to risk his heart, had invited Clara. She wore a simple, elegant gown that he had insisted on buying for her, and for a few hours, the fantasy felt real. They moved through the glittering crowd, a convincing portrait of a happy couple. Then, Mark took the stage for a toast. He raised his glass, a malicious glint in his eye, and spoke of Julian's newfound patronage of the arts, his voice dripping with sarcasm. He then turned his gaze to Clara, announcing to the silent, watchful room that her greatest performance was convincing everyone she belonged there, revealing the $25,000 deal with cruel, theatrical flair. The humiliation was instant and absolute. The air crackled with shocked whispers, which quickly morphed into sneering laughter. The flash of a dozen phone cameras felt like an interrogation lamp, pinning Clara in the spotlight of their collective judgment. Her face went ashen, the borrowed dream dissolving into a public nightmare. Julian saw the look of utter devastation in her eyes, a wound he had inadvertently inflicted, and a cold, protective fury ignited within him. But it was too late. Before he could say a word or reach for her, Clara turned and fled, her small figure swallowed by the crowd, leaving him standing alone amidst the ruins of the evening, the laughter of his peers ringing in his ears. The aftermath was a dual catastrophe. For Julian, the incident cemented his reputation as a fool, a man so emotionally bankrupt he had to buy his companionship. But that public shame was nothing compared to the private horror that followed. Hours later, after countless unanswered calls to Clara, his phone rang with an unfamiliar number. It was a nurse from the city hospital. Clara's mother had suffered a severe collapse following the shock of the evening's news, which had spread like wildfire online. She needed immediate, complex surgery to survive, a procedure with a price tag that was a cruel joke to a family already drowning in debt. The carefully constructed worlds of both Julian and Clara had not just collided, they had completely imploded. Julian didn't hesitate. He pushed through the stunned crowd, ignoring the jeers and the sharp glint of phone screens capturing his disgrace. The gala, his reputation, the entire glittering world he had built, none of it mattered. The only thing that existed was the image of Clara's face, shattered by a cruelty he had enabled. He ran through the city, a man possessed, calling her phone again and again, each unanswered ring a fresh wave of self-loathing. He drove to her apartment building, a place he only knew from a sterile address on a background check, but she wasn't there. For hours, he circled the city, a ghost in his own expensive machine, adrift in a sea of regret. Then, just as a cold dawn threatened to break, the call came from the hospital, and the true weight of the night's catastrophe finally crashed down upon him. He found her in a waiting room that smelled of antiseptic and quiet despair. The harsh fluorescent light stripped away all pretense, leaving only the raw, unfiltered truth of human fragility. She was sitting in a hard plastic chair, her simple gown now looking out of place, a painful reminder of the fantasy that had ended so brutally. Yet, even here, surrounded by fear and exhaustion, she possessed a profound stillness. She wasn't crying. Her hands were folded in her lap, her back was straight, and her gaze was fixed on the closed doors of the surgical ward. She was a lighthouse in the middle of a storm, and seeing her strength, her unyielding dignity in the face of this new, terrifying reality, made Julian feel smaller and more ashamed than he had ever felt in his entire life. He approached her slowly, the sound of his expensive shoes on the linoleum floor feeling like an intrusion. He didn't offer empty platitudes or immediate solutions. He simply sat in the chair beside her, a silent presence in the sterile room. After a long moment, he spoke, his voice raw and stripped of all its usual authority. He told her about his past, about the woman who had taught him to see love as a transaction, a weakness to be exploited. He didn't offer it as an excuse, but as a confession, laying the broken pieces of his own story at her feet. He explained how he had built a fortress of wealth around his heart, believing it would keep him safe, only to realize he had built himself a prison, and he had been its sole, lonely occupant for years. Then he turned to her, his gaze unwavering, and said the words that had been forming in his heart since she'd spoken of his kindness. "I hired you to pretend to be someone of value," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I only just realized the poorest person at that gala was me. I was so blind. I'm sorry, Clara, not for the deal, but for ever thinking your worth was something that could be bought." He reached into his coat, but instead of a checkbook, he simply placed his hand over hers. "Let me help," he pleaded softly, "not as payment, not as charity, but because your mother and you're the only family I care to have. Let me do this with you, not for you." Tears finally welled in Clara's eyes, but they were not tears of humiliation or fear. They were tears of release, of being truly seen for the first time by the man who had once looked right through her. In his confession, she didn't see a billionaire trying to solve a problem with money. She saw a man who was just as broken as she was, offering the only thing of true value he had left, his own vulnerable heart. She nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement, and squeezed his hand. In the cold, impersonal hallway of a city hospital, far from the world of glass towers and hollow laughter, their two fractured worlds finally became one. They weren't a boss and his hire, or a rich man and a poor girl. They were just two people, facing the storm together. Clara's mother's surgery was a success, a delicate dance of science and hope paid for, not with a check, but with a quiet promise Julian made to himself in that sterile waiting room. He stayed by Clara's side through the long hours of recovery, not as a benefactor, but as a partner. He brought her coffee, listened to her stories about her mother's stubborn courage, and simply held her hand when words were not enough. In the quiet hum of the hospital, he learned a new language, one spoken in shared glances and silent support. He saw the profound strength of the bond between mother and daughter, a richness he had never known. The world of billion-dollar mergers and stock market fluctuations seemed like a distant, colorless dream compared to the vibrant, terrifying, and beautiful reality of fighting for a life you loved. He wasn't saving them. They were saving him from a poverty of the soul. The experience irrevocably altered the architecture of Julian's life. He returned to his world not as the same man, but as one who had seen the true cost of a dream deferred. He severed ties with Mark and the shallow circle of friends who measured worth in dollars, their laughter at the gala now sounding like the hollow echo of a life he no longer wanted. Inspired by Clara's fierce dedication to her education against impossible odds, he did something that truly mattered. He established the Sterling Ross Foundation, a non-profit dedicated to providing full scholarships for gifted, low-income students pursuing degrees in architecture, art, and engineering. It was not a gesture of charity, it was his new mission. He personally interviewed candidates, his sharp business acumen now used to identify potential not for profit, but for human greatness. Their life together was built on a new foundation, one of shared purpose rather than shared status. Their dates were no longer staged performances at exclusive dinners, but trips to construction sites where Clara, now an intern at a prestigious firm, would passionately explain the structural integrity of a new design. They spent weekends meeting with the foundation's first scholarship recipients, listening to their stories and their ambitions. Julian discovered a fulfillment in these moments that no corporate victory had ever provided. He was no longer just building an empire of code and capital. He was helping build futures. Knowing that stories of such profound change can inspire others is what drives us, and your subscription is what makes it possible for us to keep sharing them. 5 years later, they found themselves back in the same restaurant, a glass sanctuary floating among the clouds. But the room no longer felt cold or sterile. It was filled with the warm, genuine laughter of Clara's mother, her health fully restored, and the bright, hopeful voices of the first graduating class of Sterling Ross scholars. Clara, now a licensed architect with her own burgeoning projects, held Julian's hand, her eyes sparkling with a light that had never dimmed. When a young waitress approached their table, her expression a familiar mix of fatigue and ambition, Julian looked at her with a kindness and genuine interest that was now second nature to him. He saw a person, not a solution. He had entered this place a lonely king in a glass castle, and now sat as a happy man in a room full of family, proving that the greatest wealth is not what you own, but the lives you touch.